Hello there, everybody. Happy Halloween. I hope you're having a great one. I know I sure had a great Halloween season. I've been watching tons of horror movies, and today, for my Halloween special for 2024, I'm going to be ranking in a tier list every single movie from the Halloween, Friday the 13th, and Nightmare on Elm Street franchises, the big three slasher franchises. And honestly, at this point, Scream might be able to get back up in there because they have 6 movies now. We're going to be ranking them all from best to worst in this tier list. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe for more. Check out my other horror movie ranking videos. I've done quite a few here in this week leading up to Halloween. I've had such a good time talking about horror. It's one of my favorite genres of movies. So when you look here at the tier list, you can see there are tiers, yes, S through F, even including an E tier this time. The tiers themselves are pretty self-explanatory. I don't think I need to take the time to explain them. So of course, we'll start here with Halloween from 1978, directed by John Carpenter. It basically established the slasher genre. There were other slashers before it, but it was the one that popularized the slasher genre as we knew it throughout the late 70s. There's not much point in talking about this one. This is going into slasher GOAT. Absolutely love it. I watch it every year. It's so good. So then that takes us to Friday the 13th, and Friday the 13th definitely stepped up and tried to fill the shoes of Halloween, and this one took the formula of the murderous, mysterious slasher into the woods for camp counselors, killing them left and right. Of course, we have the famous twist at the end, which spoilers for people who haven't seen it, where it's revealed that the killer isn't actually Jason Voorhees, it's his mother, Pamela Voorhees, and that adds something unique to this movie because it's not in any of the other Jason movies or any of the other movies in this franchise. But to me, this isn't a great movie. It's a good movie. It's one that I think does a serviceable job of starting this franchise. It's something that feels unique and fun and different from Halloween while establishing so many of the other cliches around the slasher genre. But for me, it's not the best Friday the 13th movie. I would put this in good time, start to finish. So that takes us to the first A Nightmare on Elm Street movie, directed by Wes Craven, and pretty much solidifying him as one of the horror GOATs in terms of horror directors. A Nightmare on Elm Street is fantastic. Freddy is an incredible villain. Heather Langenkamp is excellent as Nancy in this movie. You have Johnny Depp in this movie as well. This movie is scary from start to finish, has great tension. It uses the slasher genre as a guide, but it doesn't necessarily copy anything from a lot of the popular slashers before it. It's not a Halloween ripoff whatsoever. In many ways, this revitalized slashers. This was an excellent movie, and I certainly would put it in slasher GOAT. So now we get to Halloween 2, which came out in 1981. It was not directed by John Carpenter, but it still featured some of his involvement in the producing role and some of the writing. And Halloween 2 has gotten its due in the last few years. It's really come back, and really in a lot of ways, it is an evolution of not just Halloween, but also Friday the 13th. It takes a lot of the new horror cliches that were brought into the slasher subgenre in Friday the 13th and applies them to Halloween. Now, it is a little ridiculous that it's in a hospital. You have these doctors who really aren't the best doctors and nurses in this hospital, but it makes for an interesting confined setting. It really does. Jamie Lee Curtis is still great here. I've never loved the idea of Jamie and Michael being brother and sister, but it is one of the backbone pieces of lore in this franchise, so I've accepted it. But overall, this is a really, really good slasher movie. It's not close to the first one, but it still maintains a lot of that same fear and dread that's involved in the first one. Halloween 2 keeps that same vibe while also getting more gruesome, more gory, and embracing a lot of the things, for better or worse, that make up the slasher genre. Then next up, you have Friday the 13th Part 2, which did introduce Jason for the first time into the franchise. He is the killer here, and it really takes this franchise into what it would become, also for better or worse. As horror sequels kind of should be, it's bigger and better in almost every way. The biggest negative to me, though, is it does rely a lot on the first movie, and the first part of this movie is just completely revisiting the entirety of the end of the first Friday the 13th movie. But it's still the same setting, same vibes, similar types of characters. So in a lot of ways, this is repetitive, whereas Halloween 2 took it to at least a new setting and tried to add some more things to the lore. This is just what you thought Friday the 13th Part 1 was until the reveal happens at the end, and now you get it in full force here. But yes, it is still a good time start to finish. I'd put it in B. So next up is Freddy's Revenge. This is a movie that goes in a completely different direction. In this movie, Freddy possesses this high schooler, and it's a lot cheesier and goofier. This is when the franchise started to fall away from its original inspirations and embrace being a true mid-80s slasher. There are some pretty good moments in this, and it is not one of the worst movies in the franchise, but this one still has never been one of my favorites. Maybe I need to revisit it once again, but I'm going to put it in good at times. Next up, we have Halloween 3 Season of the Witch. This is when the franchise went away from Michael Myers. It tried to do this anthology style that John Carpenter wanted it to be, where each Halloween movie would then start to tell a different horror story, but taking place on the night of Halloween. And Season of the Witch is a pretty interesting concept when you break it down. You have this evil corporation who is selling these masks, and they are going to kill everybody who's wearing them on Halloween night. When we're talking about franchises, though, this one still feels just completely out of place. It's the one that doesn't have Michael Myers in the entire Halloween franchise, and while I appreciated their bold different direction, I still don't love rewatching this one as much as I like rewatching a lot of the other Halloween movies. For me, though, it's never been one of my favorites. I'd put it at the top of good at times. Next up, we have Friday the 13th Part 3, or Friday the 13th 3D. And some of the 3D is absolutely ridiculous in this movie. But we do get Jason's mask here, which is cool. Just like Part 1 and Part 2, this follows almost the exact same formula and style, and it is a bit tiring at this point. And like I said, for Part 1 and Part 2, Friday the 13th does a good job with its first 4 movies. Even if they are pretty similar in structure, they do give you something new and iconic that finds a place in horror history each time. And because this sticks to the formula, there is some fun to be had here still. I don't think it's nearly as good as the first 2, but I'd put it in good at times, and I'd put it ahead of A Nightmare on Elm Street 2. Next up, we have A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3, Dream Warriors, and this movie is great. I'm just going to put it up there right away. This is in the great tier. This is what a horror sequel should be. It takes the power set, it takes the lore of A Nightmare on Elm Street, and it just cranks it up in every way. It makes the kills even bloodier and scarier. It brings back the legacy characters for an impactful addition to their story. It actually has, just like the first one had Johnny Depp, this one has some pretty notable actors in it. It has Lawrence Fishburne, it has Patricia Arquette, and the asylum setting is a really good setting. Freddy Krueger here is so good. There are such memorable kills in this movie. This is without a doubt, to me, the best sequel out of all of these. I do think it's a bit of a step down from Halloween and A Nightmare on Elm Street 1, but it certainly is closer than any third movie has a right to be, so it is great. Next up is Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers, and this one is actually better than most fourth movies in slasher franchises. This is a solid movie. It's got a return to the kind of stalker home invasion style of Halloween, and it actually is pretty interesting in that aspect. It does a good job with some of the scares and the tension and the thrills. It has good pacing. Donald Pleasance is still really good as Loomis. He creates some cohesion to this franchise, and the character of Jamie Lloyd is a solidly compelling one. Really the biggest problem for Halloween 4, and it plagues a lot of the better Halloween sequels. Just the mask looks awful. I don't know what they were going for here. It looks so cheap. How could you not make it better? Ending is a little strange, and they don't really capitalize on that ending ever in the future. But overall, this is a solid Halloween movie. As Halloween movies go, and they can get really bad, this is one of the better ones. I would put it in good at times. Next up, we have Friday the 13th Part 4, The Final Chapter. And of course, this was not the final chapter because we still got 8 more movies after this. So they could retitle it to The Final Third, but this is a good movie. This is a really good movie. And at times, it's a great movie. But I think this is certainly one of the best Friday the 13th movies. It has a really gripping pace. Jason is scarier here than he has been in pretty much any other Friday the 13th movie. He's really strong here. This actually introduces characters that we care about. The Tommy Jarvis character carrying into the next 3 movies. He is a strong character, and Corey Feldman's performance as Tommy Jarvis here is really good. I really like this movie, but I don't love it as much as other people do. I think this is a really, really good Friday the 13th movie, but when we're comparing it to the rest of these franchises, I don't think I can put it in great. I don't think it's on par with something like A Nightmare on Elm Street 3. Next up is A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 4, The Dream Master. The The Dream Master is an interesting one because for me, this is a decent little movie. Unfortunately, it commits one of the worst horror movie cliche sins, and that is just randomly killing off characters for no reason after the triumph of the previous movie. All the characters from part 3, or a lot of the important ones, are just killed off unceremoniously. For me, that's extremely disappointing. It drops it for me because other than that, there are some creative kills here. Freddy is very fun and entertaining. Yes, this is when he starts to get a little bit more over the top, and we go so far into the absurd in future movies. I'd put it in mid. Next up is Halloween 5, The Revenge of Michael Myers. Danielle Harris continues here as Jamie Lloyd, but this time she's mute. This one is not good. This one is scary bad. It's a bad movie in pretty much every way. It kind of ruins Loomis. The Mask is slightly better than number 4, but still pretty bad. It follows the same cliche Halloween tropes and now embracing more of the ridiculous Friday the 13th tropes as well. And this started a trend for the next 2 Halloween movies where it introduces plot points out of nowhere that never get wrapped up. The Man in Black storyline is just out there and it never has any payoff. One of the worst Halloween movies. I'd put it in scary bad, and it's a testament to how bad a lot of these later entries in this list are going to be that I'm putting Halloween 5 in scary bad. And that includes Friday the 13th Part 5, A New Beginning. This was the movie that after they killed Jason, we've got another copycat killer for Jason. Is it Tommy Jarvis? Who is it gonna be? And the reveal is not that interesting. This is a movie that feels awkward. It doesn't feel like it needs to exist. It feels like a cash grab. It just wants to live in the shadow of Jason to give us a year off from Jason before they eventually bring him back. So to me, it's a hollow movie. Even though the subject matter here could have been kind of interesting, I don't really like this one either. It's better than Halloween 5 though, but I'm gonna put it in scary bad. That brings us to A Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child. This is where we go off the rails with this franchise. The character development is bad. The Alice character doesn't get much more character development. The one thing this franchise always has going for it is the creative kills. There are so many creative ways they use the dream sequences, and even in the bad movies, there are still some really fun and entertaining moments with Freddy. But I was not digging the plot of this one. I think it's so contrived and ridiculous. I'd still put it ahead of these 2 movies in scary bad. I think it's just slightly better. Next up is Halloween 6, The Curse of Michael Myers, and this is when we get into the Cult of Thorn stuff, and it's so bad. This stuff is just so dumb. We don't need to explain Michael's evil. He has now become the most over-explained slasher killer at this point. This movie is a bit stronger in the scare aspects to me than Part 5. It's a little less formulaic, which I give it at least credit for trying something new. Just the new stuff doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. It's not fleshed out enough. It's really just ideas for ideas' sake. It's ideas to keep a franchise running. It's not really ideas because they had something new and interesting to tell. And you can really tell that with the end. Paul Rudd is in this movie, and I guess he's kind of a bright spot. His character's not very good, but it's Paul Rudd, so you enjoy watching him. For me, it's still gonna be scary bad. I'd put it ahead of Halloween 5 though, because Halloween 5 to me is just the same old thing we've seen a million times, but even worse than before. And Halloween 6 at least tries something different, even if it is also pretty bad. And you'd think I would continue to be negative in this part of the video when we get to the 6th movies of these franchises, but no. When we're talking about Jason Lives, we're actually talking about a movie that's gonna go up to great for me. I love Jason Lives. This is my favorite Friday the 13th movie. It does a great job of balancing comedy and scares. It gets really scary when it needs to be, but it's very funny, self-aware, and campy also at the same time. It rides that beautiful line between camp and good slasher horror. Jason's resurrection was just dumb enough for me to actually work, very much so Frankenstein inspired, and Tommy Jarvis continues to be a really good character. This movie is so much fun to me. I'd put it behind Dream Warriors, though. It's not as good of a movie. Then we get to the 6th movie in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, which is Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare. And good God, this one is unbearable. This movie is so rough. Freddy's not really scary anymore. He's just a straight up comedian. There are some really over the top ridiculous kills, like the playing with power Nintendo kill. And this movie can be watched as a guilty pleasure in some ways. It is certainly an awful movie. But don't worry, it will be joined by some more movies here soon, but not by Halloween H2O or Halloween 20. I do like this movie quite a bit. Jamie Lee Curtis returns for the first time since Halloween 2 and gives a really strong performance, a performance that I think a lot of Halloween 2018 should have kind of tried to replicate. This is a Laurie Strode trying to move on with her life. She sought solace in her family, and of course that's led to her becoming an overprotective mother, especially on Halloween every year. And of course she's right, because he comes to get her now. There are a lot of late 90s, early 2000s isms in this movie that I think do detract from it a little bit, but the story and the tension still hold for the most part. Unfortunately, like Halloween 4, we have to talk about how another decent Halloween movie is ruined by an awful mask. This time they go with a CGI mask for Michael, and yes, this is a late 90s movie, so the CGI does not look good, but overall the movie is good enough to make up for that. I'd put Halloween H2O in good time start to finish. This is a fun movie and certainly the best Halloween movie we had gotten since Halloween 2. Then we have Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood. This movie introduces a character that has telekinesis in it, and it's where this whole franchise starts to just say, hey, let's try to figure out some type of gimmick we can throw into each movie. And as dumb as that actually sounds, this movie is watchable. It's entertaining at times because Tina is a fairly good protagonist for this series. Kane Hodder does a really good job playing Jason here. Some of the prosthetics look really nice on Jason. But for a 7th movie in a slasher franchise, it's certainly watchable. I'd put it right behind A Nightmare on Elm Street 4 in mid. Now we get the 7th movie in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, and this one is kind of a Nightmare on Elm Street movie, kind of not. It's Wes Craven's new Nightmare. This was Wes Craven's return to this franchise, and it's his precursor to Scream. This is a very meta movie. It takes the actors from the first A Nightmare on Elm Street movie and lets them play their real life selves as they're getting attacked by Freddy Krueger in the real world. Heather Langenkamp and Robert Englund give great performances here. Robert Englund both as himself and as Freddy Krueger, and Freddy Krueger is much scarier in here than he has been in a long time. This is the scariest he's been since the 3rd movie. He's really good, and the writing here is excellent. The writing is kind of what carries this movie. I'd put New Nightmare right behind Jason Lives. It's a better movie than Jason Lives, no doubt about that, but I love Jason Lives, so I'm going to put that ahead of it. So we're getting into the 8th parts here, and we're getting to Halloween Resurrection, which I love watching this movie. It is unbearably bad, but it is hilarious. So the unbearable category doesn't necessarily ring true to how I feel about Halloween Resurrection, because it is one of the worst movies, if not the worst movie we're going to talk about here. But this movie is so funny. This is the definition of a guilty pleasure. It's the definition of a so bad it's good movie. This movie sucks so bad that it is so much fun to watch. Then we have Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, and while that sounds like an amazing concept, and it actually is pretty good once it gets to Manhattan, the whole movie takes place on a boat. The first 2/3, if not more, take place on a boat where he's just doing the traditional stalker, slasher, killer stuff, and with characters we don't care about, with characters who are uninteresting. It's probably a little better than Halloween Resurrection, but I would put it behind because while I can only enjoy about 15 minutes of this movie, I can enjoy most of Halloween Resurrection for the wrong reasons. Next up is the A Nightmare on Elm Street remake from 2010, and this movie is pretty scary bad. Jackie Earle Haley is pretty good as Freddy. He's menacing, at least. It doesn't have the same charm or fun as Robert Englund's performance at all. This is just one of those movies that embraces such a dark tone. It tries to be that late 2000s post-Dark Knight, darker, more serious version of an original source material, and by doing that, it loses everything that makes the original great. It has no real concept of the spirit of what it's remaking. When you make a remake, it needs to at least embrace what the spirit of the original was, even if you tell that story in a different fashion. This one at times is a trudge to get through, unfortunately. It's more competently made than Halloween 5 or 6, so I'd put it right here in scary bad. Next up, we have the Halloween remake from Rob Zombie from 2007. This one at least tries to keep the spirit of what Halloween is. It really goes for more lore around the Myerses, which I think is a much worse idea, especially with the way Rob Zombie creates the Myers family. They are so unlikable, all of them. not just Michael, but every person in their family is terrible. This movie is mostly additional stuff to the Halloween formula, which I do appreciate when you do actually get to remaking scenes from Halloween. They are good and they're intense and they work well. Now that we have the hindsight of having Laurie and Michael as brother and sister in this movie, we've now retroactively made that a plot line of the remake of the original Halloween. It does add a bit to their conflict, but ultimately, I mean, it's not going to ever be as good as the original Halloween. So I have to put it at good at times. It will be at the bottom of good at times. Then we have Jason Goes to Hell, the 9th Friday the 13th movie, and we'll get it out of the way. This movie is unbearable. This is going to be my last and unbearable because I don't really like anything about this movie. I think the story is convoluted and contrived. There's no Jason in this movie pretty much whatsoever. It takes itself far too seriously while also being an abysmally written movie and a movie with awful characters. And so this is, to me, the worst movie we're going to be talking about here. I really do not enjoy watching this. So here we have the Halloween 2 from 2009, Rob Zombie's second Halloween movie, and it has pretty much nothing to do with Halloween 2, the original version from 1981. This movie goes full zombie, and at times that's interesting because it's so different. You at least can watch this movie, and even as part of this remake series, it has a complete identity of its own. It is its own weird, outlandish thing. Some people really like that. More people hate that. I'm on the side of more hating it than liking it. To me, this doesn't really feel much like a Halloween movie. It feels too much like a Rob Zombie movie. Michael is still intimidating, and there are some violent, gruesome moments in this movie for sure. And a focus on Laurie's trauma does work occasionally for this. But going with all the stuff about their mom and just to have Rob Zombie's wife in the movie as well, none of that works. They also do a terrible job with Loomis in this movie. He is unhinged. There's nothing really redeeming about him. It's kind of like Halloween 5. Best, I can give this movie a mid rating. Now we have Jason X, which takes Jason to space. And this movie is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, it was supposed to be ridiculous, right? So when you're watching Jason X, you got to take it a little tongue in cheek. Unfortunately, this movie just doesn't embrace its setting enough. It doesn't embrace the idea of Jason in space enough. Some kills are creative, but others are too simple. These characters are so ridiculous, and they shouldn't be as ridiculous as the camp teenagers are. But overall, this is a movie that I still don't really like. It would be at the bottom of my scary bad tier. Now we move far into the future to the Halloween 2018 by David Gordon Green. And 2018's Halloween is a movie that I've gone back and forth with. When I first saw it, I thought it was great. I really loved the new, modern, nice looking aesthetic for Halloween. Michael was brutal, some of the most brutal kills he's had. There's a great tracking shot when Michael first gets back to Haddonfield that I thought worked really well, and I still appreciate all those things about this movie. But on my subsequent rewatches, the characters besides Laurie and Michael are really bad. There are some really awful dialogue, and still though, when it is Michael versus Laurie, this is a strong movie, and Jamie Lee Curtis is really good here. Michael is really good here. But overall, I'd say this is a good time start to finish for me. It's really a toss-up for me between H2O and Halloween 2018. I think I'd give the slight edge to 2018. I think it's a little bit better made movie. Then we get to Freddy vs. Jason, which I moved here after the remake. If you've seen some of my other rankings, you know I have a soft spot for this movie. I think this movie is really fun. The characters are awful. The story is kind of dumb, but this movie delivers on Freddy vs. Jason. There are multiple fight sequences. There is a lot of use of what makes Friday the 13th great and what makes A Nightmare on Elm Street great. So this could have easily been a ridiculous, cheap cash grab with one tiny little fight and nothing else. But this movie at least delivers on the fights. To me, it's like a B-level Godzilla movie where if you hit on the fights, we don't really care about the characters or the story if the fights are really good. If the fights are mid, then we're going to focus more on the characters and the story. And so for me, Freddy vs. Jason is going to go into good time start to finish, which then takes us back to Halloween for Halloween Kills, the second movie in the David Gordon Green trilogy. And to me, this one is really bad. I'd put it in scary bad. It would be higher than everything else in scary bad so far. This movie is absolutely ridiculous. There is no reason for this to exist. It's one of those movies that when you start it and then you finish it, nothing has changed. The new characters that are introduced and the legacy characters that are brought back are just cannon fodder for Michael. Laurie is sidelined in this movie, so nothing really happens with her and her character. The only thing it has going for it is in the title. It's the kills. It's Michael Unleashed. This is the most brutal Michael movie. But for me, that can't really save it. It's more mean-spirited, gruesome kills than it really is creative ways to do something like maybe A Nightmare on Elm Street does, or Friday the 13th does at times. And the evil dies tonight thing is so dumb. It just does not work. This is a movie that does not work for me. Then we get to the Friday the 13th remake from 2009, and this movie is actually fairly good. As I said in my Friday the 13th rankings, I'm not a huge fan of the look of a lot of 2000s slashers, especially remakes of 80s slashers. I think they lose a lot of their color, a lot of the things that make them fun and enjoyable from the 80s in their visual design. And while that is here, and a lot of the characters aren't as fun or ridiculous as the 80s, there are some really good moments and a lot of solid tension in this movie. Characters are the biggest weakness of this movie. There's not really any great characters in this movie, maybe a couple who are serviceable, but nobody that you really care all that much if they live or die. Jason is really menacing in this, and in a lot of ways he's the scariest that he's ever been, even if he is faster and more intense than he usually is in most of these Friday the 13th movies. I really like the cold open and the way it feeds into the rest of the story. It worked really well for me. And overall, I think this movie is good at times. I would put it at the top of good at times. And that takes us to the final movie we're going to be talking about, and that is Halloween Ends. Halloween Ends is a tough one as well. This is a very mixed movie. You have the story starting to progress more. Again, you have more Laurie Strode, which is certainly welcome. But of course, we have to talk about the character of Corey Cunningham, who is certainly a mixed element of this story. I get what they were going for. I like that there was something a little different to this, but this movie was sold as the final Michael Myers movie, the final Halloween movie, even though I'm sure it won't be. This was sold as the last one, and I think it truly will be the last for Laurie Strode, for Jamie Lee Curtis. I doubt she comes back. So it was sold as the final Michael Laurie showdown. And while we do get that, and when we do get that, it is pretty great. I did actually really enjoy it. Outside of that, this movie flounders for a reason to exist, and that's why I think a lot of the things in Kills could have been brought into this and married perfectly with the Michael and Laurie stuff in this to create a semi-decent movie. As it stands now, you have too many plot lines, too many ideas going all over the place. And while the Corey thing could have been interesting in its own style Halloween movie, maybe a Halloween movie that existed after Halloween Ends, it doesn't necessarily fit this movie. I'm gonna say Halloween Ends is mid, and those are my rankings of the Halloween, Friday the 13th, and A Nightmare on Elm Street franchises. What are your guys' rankings? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you all next time.